The waiting room at Northside Children's Medical Center smelled like antiseptic and old coffee, and the particular kind of anxiety that comes from people sitting in plastic chairs hoping for news that has not arrived yet. It was a Tuesday morning in February, cold enough that the windows had fogged at the corners, and the heating system was working hard enough that you could hear it. The room was full. Every chair occupied. Children in laps, parents with phones pressed to ears, a toddler sleeping across two seats with his coat folded under his head like a pillow. Daniel Oss did not notice any of this when he walked in. He noticed the girl. She was sitting alone in the second row from the back. 7 years old, maybe 8. Small for her age, with her hair in 2 careful braids that someone had done with attention even if not recently. She was wearing a blue puffer coat that was slightly too large for her, and she had a backpack on her lap that she held with both arms wrapped around it, the way children hold things when they are trying to feel less alone. She was not crying. That was the first thing Daniel noticed. Children who sat alone in waiting rooms and were not crying were children who had learned not to. Daniel was 44 years old, the founder and CEO of OSI Medical Logistics, a company that supplied equipment and pharmaceuticals to hospitals across 6 states. He knew Northside Children's Medical Center well. He had supplied them for 11 years. He came twice a year for partnership reviews and knew the layout of the building better than most of the staff. He had a 9 o'clock meeting with the hospital's procurement director on the 4th floor. He had 40 minutes. He looked at the girl again. His assistant, Grace Mensa, walked beside him with her tablet already open, already pulling up the morning's agenda. She had worked with Daniel for 7 years and had developed the particular skill of knowing when he was about to make a decision that was not on the schedule. She stopped when he stopped. "Sir." Daniel was still looking at the girl. "Who is she waiting for?" he said. Grace followed his gaze. "I don't know." "Find out," he said, gently. Grace set her tablet under her arm and walked toward the reception desk. Daniel moved to a chair 3 seats from the girl and sat down. He did not look at his phone. He looked at the room the way he looked at logistics problems, mapping what was present, what was missing, and where the gap was. The girl glanced at him once, the way children glanced at adults in waiting rooms. Checking, assessing, filing him away as probably safe but not confirmed. Daniel did not speak first. He waited. After 2 minutes, the girl said, without looking at him, "Are you waiting for someone too?" "Not in the same way you are," Daniel said. She looked at him then directly. She had serious, dark eyes and the expression of a child who had spent considerable time understanding things adults thought she was too young for. "My name's Zara," she said. "Daniel," he said. "Are you a doctor?" "No," he said. "I work with hospitals, but I'm not a doctor." Zara considered this. "My dad's in there," she said, gesturing toward the set of double doors marked with a restricted access sign. "He's been in there since last night." Daniel kept his voice even. "Is someone here with you?" She shook her head. "My aunt was here, but she had to go to work. She said she'd come back at lunch." Daniel looked at the clock on the wall. It was 8:47 in the morning. Grace returned to his side, crouching slightly to speak quietly. "Receptionist says the girl's been here since 6:30 this morning. Father was brought in last night, emergency, something with his heart. Girl came with an aunt who left at 7:45. Grace paused. "They flagged her for family services, but nothing's been actioned yet." Daniel nodded once. "Sit with her," he said. "I'll be back in a moment." Grace took the chair beside Zara with the easy warmth of someone who had nieces and knew how to use it. Daniel walked to the reception desk. The woman behind it was in her mid-30s, clearly stretched across too many things simultaneously. She looked up with the expression of someone who was about to explain that he needed to take a number. Then she recognized him. "Mr. Oss," she said, straightening slightly. "The girl in the blue coat," Daniel said. "Zara. What's her father's status?" The woman hesitated. "I'm not sure I can share." "You can share what you can," Daniel said. "I'm not asking for clinical details. I'm asking if that child has been seen to." The woman glanced toward Zara, then back at him. "The duty social worker has been paged. We're waiting for a call back." "How long has the page been in?" She checked her screen. 40 minutes. Daniel looked at her steadily. "Please page again." and get me the name of whoever is managing the father's case. She typed quickly. That would be the cardiac unit coordinator, Mrs. Patricia Holloway. Is she in the building? She should be, yes. Please let her know Daniel Osai would like 5 minutes of her time at her earliest convenience. Tell her it's regarding the welfare of a patient's minor dependent currently unattended in the waiting room. The receptionist picked up her phone before he had finished the sentence. Daniel went back to Zara. Grace had already established a foothold. Zara was showing her something in her backpack, a small notebook with drawings in it, and Grace was looking at them with genuine attention, which was the only kind that worked with perceptive children. Daniel sat on Zara's other side. Your drawings? He asked. Zara nodded. I draw when I'm worried, she said. My dad taught me that. Daniel looked at the open page. It was a careful drawing of a man and a girl standing in front of a house. The man was tall with a round face. The girl had 2 braids. Underneath, in uneven letters that had clearly been practiced, me and Daddy. He taught you well, Daniel said. Zara looked at the drawing for a moment, then closed the notebook carefully. Is he going to be okay? She asked. Daniel did not lie to her, and he did not make promises he could not keep. I don't know, he said, but I'm going to find out what's happening. Is that all right with you? She studied his face the same way she had studied everything, thoroughly and without hurry. Okay, she said. A woman in hospital administrative clothing appeared from a side corridor. She was in her 50s, efficient-looking, with reading glasses on a chain and the expression of someone managing 17 things, and managing them competently. Mr. Osai, she said, extending her hand. Patricia Holloway, you asked about the Mensah family. Daniel stood. The father, Mr. Mensah, how is he? Patricia glanced toward Zara, then back at Daniel, recalibrating. He's stable, she said carefully. He was brought in with acute cardiac symptoms. He's in observation. We expect him to be moved to a general ward later this morning. Daniel felt something release. He kept his expression neutral. And his daughter. Patricia's expression shifted to something more complicated. That's an ongoing situation. Social services has been paged. 40 minutes ago, Daniel said. I know. Patricia did not flinch. Our protocols require. I understand your protocols, Daniel said. I also understand that a 7-year-old child has been sitting alone in that waiting room since 6:30 this morning. What I'd like to understand is what is being done about it right now. Patricia straightened slightly. I assure you, Mr. Osai, we take child welfare very seriously. I believe you, Daniel said. Show me. What followed was an education in the gap between policy and reality. Patricia Holloway was not a bad woman. She was, in fact, a very competent woman operating inside a system that had too few people and too many needs, and had developed, over time, the particular institutional habit of documenting care rather than providing it. The social worker assigned to the pediatric ward was covering 3 departments simultaneously. The callback had not come, because she was currently in a case meeting on the 3rd floor that had run 40 minutes over its scheduled end. The protocol for unattended minors required a flag, a page, a callback, a form, and then an assessment. A sequence that, in theory, took 30 minutes and in practice took whatever time the system had available, which was rarely 30 minutes. Zara had been flagged correctly. She was in the system. She was not, however, being attended to. Daniel stood in Patricia's office with the door open so he could see Grace still sitting with Zara in the waiting room. He could see Zara showing Grace another drawing. Here is what I need to understand, Daniel said, his voice measured and without drama. If I walked out of this building right now, what happens to that child in the next hour? Patricia paused. It was a real pause, not stalling, but thinking. She waits for the social worker, Patricia said finally. And if the social worker's meeting runs another hour? Patricia did not answer. She's been here since 6:30, Daniel said. Has anyone offered her food? Patricia's jaw tightened slightly. I'll check. I already know the answer, Daniel said. I asked Grace to check the moment we sat down. Nobody has. He kept his voice level. I'm not here to create problems for your department. I'm here because a child is sitting in that room and nobody has brought her so much as a glass of water. Whatever the protocols say, that is not something I can walk past. Patricia sat back slightly. What would you like to do, Mr. Osai? I'd like someone from the cardiac unit to come down and speak with Zara and tell her, in language she can understand, that her father is stable and he is being taken care of. I'd like food brought to her. I'd like the social worker paged again with the information that the CEO of Osai Medical Logistics is present and would like an update within 20 minutes. Patricia blinked once. I can do that. And I'd like to know, Daniel added, who authorized the classification that moved the Mensa family to a secondary insurance tier last Thursday. Patricia went very still. Daniel reached into his jacket pocket and placed a printed document on her desk. It was a copy of a hospital system notification, the kind that was generated automatically when a patient's file was reclassified. I don't usually review individual patient files, Daniel said. But Grace noticed this when she was pulling up this morning's meeting materials. The Mensa family was reclassified from primary to secondary coverage on Thursday. That reclassification affects treatment priority flags. It also, as of this morning, affects whether the duty social worker's callback is marked urgent or routine. The man's name was Gregory Fitch. He was the hospital's insurance verification coordinator. 41 years old, 12 years in the role. The kind of man who had been doing the same thing for long enough that he had stopped examining whether what he was doing was right, and had replaced that examination with the simpler question of whether it was procedurally correct. The reclassification of Thomas Mensa's file from primary to secondary insurance coverage had been procedurally correct. It had been made because Thomas Mensa had missed a premium payment in January. The payment had been missed because Thomas Mensa had been between jobs in January, a gap of 11 days between the end of one logistics contract and the beginning of another. During those 11 days, his auto payment had failed. He had caught the error and paid the outstanding amount on January 21st. The payment was logged in the system. What Gregory Fitch had not done was reclassify the file back to primary coverage after the payment cleared. This was not, as it turned out, unusual. When Grace pulled the full account history, which she was given access to by Patricia Holloway after a terse phone call that Daniel was not in the room for, they found that the reclassification had been applied at the time of the missed payment and never reversed, despite the payment having been received and logged 14 days earlier. Thomas Mensa's treatment that morning had been proceeding under secondary coverage protocols, which meant slower authorization for additional tests, which meant a longer observation window before upgrade to a standard ward, which meant Zara had been sitting in the waiting room for 2 additional hours beyond what would have been necessary if her father's file had reflected the coverage he had actually paid for. Daniel read Grace's summary twice. Then he looked through Patricia's glass office wall at the waiting room, where Zara was now eating a granola bar someone had finally brought her, and showing the cardiac unit nurse, a young woman named Sandra who had come down specifically at Patricia's request, the drawing of her and her father. He turned back to the document. Gregory Fitch appeared in the doorway of Patricia's office at 9:47. He was a compact man with the slightly defensive posture of someone who had been called into a room he did not expect to be called into. He looked at Daniel, he looked at Patricia, he looked at the document on the desk. I understand there's a question about the Mensa file, he said. More than one, Daniel replied. Gregory set his shoulders. The reclassification was made in accordance with our missed payment protocol. The payment was received on January 21st, Grace said, from her seat beside the desk. She turned her tablet to show the transaction record. Cleared on January 23rd. Today is February 6th. The file has been at secondary for 14 days after the payment cleared. Gregory looked at the screen. There can be a processing lag. 14 days is not a lag, Daniel said. That is a gap. Tell me the difference. Gregory shifted. Our processing queue is extensive. Who manages it? My team. How many files in your backlog right now? Gregory hesitated. I'd have to check. Check, Daniel said. Another pause. Gregory pulled out his phone, typed something. Approximately 400. Daniel looked at him. Files that have received payment but not been reclassified back to primary. Gregory's posture tightened. Not necessarily. Approximately, Daniel said. Gregory did not answer. Patricia spoke from her corner of the room. Her voice was quiet and precise. Gregory, how long has this been the standard processing timeline? Gregory looked at her. We've discussed the staffing situation. We've been operating with reduced headcount since October. Since October, Daniel repeated. He sat back slightly. He looked at the window. He thought about the 400 files. He thought about 400 Thomas Menses paying their premiums and receiving secondary protocols without knowing why. He thought about how many of them had children sitting in waiting rooms that nobody had brought food to. He looked at Gregory. I want the complete list, Daniel said. Every file reclassified to secondary coverage due to a payment gap, where the payment has subsequently cleared, and the file has not been reclassified back. Gregory stared at him. That's a significant data pull. I know, Daniel said. Start it now. Gregory looked at Patricia. Patricia gave him the smallest nod. Gregory left the office. Daniel turned to Patricia. His team is understaffed. Yes, she said. That's not his fault. No, she agreed. But the result is the same for the patients. Daniel looked at the document again. I want to understand the full scope before I make any decisions about what happens next, but I want Thomas Mensa's file corrected this morning, before 11 o'clock. Patricia nodded. I'll make sure of it. And I want someone to sit with Zara until her aunt arrives or until her father is well enough to see her. Not a form, a person. Patricia picked up her phone. Zara's father's name was Thomas Mensa. He was 34 years old. He had come to Chicago from Ghana 11 years ago, working first in warehousing, then moving into logistics coordination, building skills methodically and without complaint. He was good at his work and known for it. He had a daughter named Zara who drew pictures when she was worried and had her mother's eyes and her father's stubborn patience. Zara's mother had died 3 years ago. Thomas had raised Zara alone since then, with help from his sister Abina when the hours ran long. Daniel learned this not from a file, but from Grace, who had spent the morning sitting with Zara and listening in the careful way that produced more information than direct questions. He learned it at 10:45, standing in the corridor outside the waiting room, while inside, a hospital social worker who had finally arrived, apologetic and genuinely concerned, was sitting with Zara and Sandra the nurse, going through the morning's events. She hasn't eaten since last night, Grace said. She told me she didn't want to ask because she didn't want to bother anyone. Daniel said nothing. She also said, Grace continued, that she was worried that if she made trouble, they might not let her see her dad. Daniel closed his eyes briefly. She's 7 years old, Grace said, not as an accusation, as a fact that needed to be spoken out loud. I know, Daniel said. She's been managing this entire morning on the theory that if she sat quietly and waited and didn't ask for anything, things would work out. Daniel opened his eyes. And nobody rewarded that, he said. Grace shook her head. Nobody even noticed it. This was the part that did not leave him. Not the insurance classification, not the processing backlog, not Gregory Fitch or the 400 files. It was the theory. The operating assumption of a 7-year-old child, drawn from some accumulated experience, that asking for things was more dangerous than not having them. Daniel walked back into the waiting room. Zara looked up when he came in. The social worker, a woman named Joy, which seemed, to Daniel, both appropriate and slightly heartbreaking, looked up as well. Mr. Osei, Joy said. Daniel sat in the chair beside Zara. How are you doing? He asked her. Zara considered the question seriously. Better, she said. Sandra told me Daddy is awake. She said he asked about me. He did, Daniel confirmed. He had called the cardiac unit directly at 10:30. Zara's face changed then, not dramatically, just the small release of something that had been held tight all morning. Can I see him? She asked. They're getting his room ready, Daniel said. 30 minutes, they told me. Then you can go in. Zara nodded. She looked down at her notebook, then back up at him. Did you fix it? she asked. Daniel looked at her. Fix what? Whatever was wrong, she said. You were fixing something, I could tell. He studied her for a moment, 7 years old, her father's stubborn patience and her mother's eyes. We found something that needed correcting, he said. We're correcting it. Zara nodded as if this was acceptable. Then she opened her notebook to a new page and picked up her pencil. What are you drawing? Daniel asked. I don't know yet, she said. I draw it first and then I find out. Thomas Mensah was moved to a standard ward at 11:15. His file had been reclassified to primary coverage at 10:58, following a direct authorization from Patricia Holloway and the reversal of Gregory Fitch's incomplete processing. The additional tests the cardiac team had wanted to run, tests that had been pending authorization for 6 hours under secondary protocols, were approved within 20 minutes of the reclassification. At 11:30, Zara walked through the door of room 14 in the cardiac ward with her backpack over her shoulder and her notebook tucked under her arm. Thomas Mensah, who was thin and pale and connected to 2 monitors, and had the face of a man who had been frightened and was trying not to show it to his daughter, saw her come through the door, and his expression did something that Daniel, standing at the end of the corridor, could see from a distance. It opened, not with words, with the particular involuntary softening that happened when a parent who had been scared saw their child safe and present. Zara went straight to him without running, carefully, the way she moved through everything, and sat on the edge of the bed, and he put his arm around her, and neither of them said anything for a moment. Daniel turned away. Grace was beside him. She brought him the notebook, Grace said. Daniel nodded. To show him what she drew while she was waiting. He said nothing. Grace let the silence hold for a few seconds, then said, Gregory's team completed the initial pull. 263 files with outstanding reclassification. Payments received, files not corrected. Daniel turned away from the door of room 14. How far back? Some go back as far as 8 months. He absorbed this. We'll come back to that, he said. Get me the name of the hospital's board chair, and get me a meeting with the CFO this week. Grace made a note, and Gregory. Daniel considered this carefully. Gregory Fitch was not a villain. He was a man with 400 files and not enough people and a system that had grown gaps in the dark because nobody was looking at the right things. That was a management failure, not a personal one. Gregory stays, Daniel said. But his department gets what it needs to do this properly, whatever that costs. He paused. That comes from us. Grace raised an eyebrow slightly. We supply this hospital, Daniel said. We have a stake in how it operates. If there's a resourcing gap that's producing outcomes like this, we contribute to closing it. Grace typed quickly. That's going to be significant. It should be, Daniel said. He went back to room 14 at noon. Thomas was more alert now, propped slightly upright, the color returning to his face in increments. Zara was cross-legged on the visitor's chair with her notebook open, showing her father each drawing in sequence, narrating them in a voice too low for Daniel to hear from the doorway. Thomas looked up when Daniel appeared. He had been told, briefly, by the nurse Sandra, that a man named Daniel Osai had spent the morning addressing a situation with his daughter and his file. He had not been told what that meant specifically. He was still processing the morning, waking in a hospital room, the fear, the monitors, asking about Zara, and being told she was in the waiting room and that someone was with her. Daniel stepped inside. Mr. Mensah, I'm Daniel Osai. Thomas studied him the same way Zara studied things, carefully and without rushing. You're the man who stayed with her, Thomas said. My assistant did most of the staying, Daniel said. I dealt with some paperwork. Thomas's expression moved. Sandra told me it was more than paperwork. Daniel pulled up the visitor's chair beside Zara, who shifted her notebook to show him the page she was currently on. It was a drawing of 2 figures in a hospital room, one in a bed, one in a chair beside it, both with names above them in her careful, uneven letters, Daddy, me. Daniel looked at it for a moment, then at Thomas. Your file had been incorrectly maintained, Daniel said. He kept kept it simple and factual. Your coverage had been flagged to secondary after a payment gap in January, but the flag wasn't reversed when your payment cleared. It's been corrected. Everything that was pending authorization this morning has been approved. Thomas absorbed this. That's why they kept saying they were waiting for authorization. Yes. Thomas looked at the ceiling briefly, something moving through his face. Then he looked back at Daniel. And if you hadn't been here this morning, Daniel did not answer with reassurance. The social worker was already in process, he said. The system would have caught it eventually. Thomas nodded slowly. Eventually. Yes, Daniel said. That's the part that changes. Thomas looked at him directly. How? Daniel rested his forearms on his knees. The hospital has a backlog of incorrectly maintained insurance files. We're going to fund the staffing to clear it and put a system in place so it doesn't rebuild. All 263 outstanding cases are being reviewed today. Thomas stared at him. You're funding it? Yes. Why? Daniel looked at Zara, who was drawing again, adding details to the hospital room picture with focused concentration. Because I supply this hospital, he said. And I should have been paying more attention to how it functions, not just what it needs. Thomas followed his gaze to Zara. Something shifted in his face. She stayed all morning, Thomas said quietly. She did. She didn't make a fuss. No, Daniel said. She didn't think she was allowed to. Thomas pressed his lips together. A father receiving information about his child that hit somewhere specific and deep. Her mother was the same way, he said finally. Always afraid that asking for things would make things worse. Daniel said nothing. I've been trying to teach her differently, Thomas said. That she can ask, that it's safe to ask. She will learn it, Daniel said. She's watching you. Thomas looked at his daughter for a moment, then back at Daniel. You didn't have to stay, he said. Daniel stood slowly. No, he said, but I'm glad I did. Thomas extended his hand from the bed. Daniel took it. The handshake was brief and complete. He left the hospital at 12:40. Grace walked beside him through the lobby. The waiting room was different now from the morning. Different people, different weight of need, the same plastic chairs and antiseptic smell in fogged window corners. Daniel looked at the second row from the back. The chair where Zara had been sitting was empty. He looked at it for a moment, then kept walking. Outside, the February cold hit clean and sharp. He stood on the steps for a second before moving toward the car. Grace came beside him. The board chair's office called back, she said. They can do Thursday. Thursday is fine. And the CFO wants details of the funding proposal before the meeting. Rachel will have the outline to him by end of day tomorrow. Grace made a note, then she paused. Are you going to the fourth floor meeting? Daniel looked at her. The procurement director, the 9 o'clock, the reason he had been in the building at all. Reschedule it, he said. Grace almost smiled. Already did. They walked to the car. Daniel got in, Grace on the other side. The engine started and the heat came on. Daniel sat for a moment before pulling out. He thought about Gregory Fitch, who had not been malicious, just overloaded. He thought about the 400 files that had been drifting in the dark of an understaffed department for 8 months. He thought about 263 people who had paid their premiums and received secondary care without knowing the reason. He thought about Zara drawing pictures of her father to manage her worry. About the theory she was operating on. That asking was dangerous. That silence was protection. That the best strategy for a 7-year-old alone in a waiting room was to take up as little space as possible and hope someone noticed anyway. Some of them, Daniel knew, had been noticed. Many had not. He pulled out of the parking lot and into the February street. Grace was typing beside him, already 3 steps ahead, already organizing what came next. Grace, he said. She looked up. The social worker, Joy. Yes. She's covering 3 departments. Grace checked her tablet. Correct. Same problem as Gregory's department. Understaffed. Yes, Grace said. Daniel looked at the road. Add it to the proposal. Grace typed. Done. They drove in silence for a moment. Then Grace said, for what it's worth. Daniel glanced at her. She's going to be fine, Grace said. Zara. Daniel looked back at the road. I know. She drew a picture of you, Grace added. While you were in Patricia's office, she showed me. Daniel said nothing. "You were very tall in it," Grace said. "And she wrote your name, she spelled it right." Daniel kept his eyes on the road. The February city moved around the car, ordinary and enormous, and full of people navigating systems that worked for some of them and failed others in ways that were quiet enough to go unnoticed. "Make sure the accounting team tracks the outcomes," he said. "Not just the funding, the actual outcomes, how many files corrected, how many cases improved, how many people received the coverage they paid for." Grace was already typing. "And Zara's father." Daniel considered. "Quarterly check-in," he said. "Not charity, not special treatment, just make sure the system is working the way it should for him, for his file." Grace looked at him, and if it isn't, Daniel exhaled slowly. "Then we fix it again." Because that was the point. Not one morning in one waiting room. Not one file corrected, one child fed, one frightened father reclassified. The point was the system. The point was the 263, and the ones after them, and the ones after that. The point was that somewhere in the gap between what a system was supposed to do and what it actually did, real people were sitting in plastic chairs with backpacks on their laps, waiting to be seen, operating on theories about silence being safer than asking. And the job, not just Daniel's job, but the job was to build something that made that theory wrong. Grace closed her tablet. The city passed around them. And somewhere on the 4th floor of Northside Children's Medical Center, Thomas Mensah was looking at a drawing his daughter had made of the two of them in a hospital room, both with their names written above them in careful, uneven letters. Not crossed out, not reclassified, just there. 3 months later, the hospital's insurance verification department had been fully staffed. All 263 outstanding files had been corrected. A new oversight protocol had been implemented requiring dual authorization for any downward coverage reclassification and automatic review of any file that remained in a reclassified status beyond 72 hours after a payment was received. Gregory Fitch had not been removed. He had been given what he needed to do the job correctly, and he was doing it. Joy, the social worker, was no longer covering 3 departments. Zara Mensah, age 7, had won her school's February.
It's a February morning in Chicago, and we're exploring this enormous city, the whole vast web of lives and names and systems that define us.